My name is Maeder. I'm a researcher at this unique University of Arts and as well as the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, ETH. I'm working in the field of acoustic ecology. But I'm also an artist, so I somehow lead a double life. So in most of my projects, I try to do two things at the same time. At one hand, scientific research. At the other hand, the aesthetic or artistic perspective on the things that I investigate. And one of my projects is sounding soil, which is at the same time my dissertation project at ETH that I'm going to finish this summer. And as you see, there are a lot of partners in the project. So that's not only alone me, it's meanwhile about 6 institutions that are partners in that research project and in follow-up projects. And I'm going to tell you a little bit what it is all about and what we did in the last years. So actually all began here in that meadow in the Swiss Alps. I just came from another research project where we investigated the sounds of trees, especially drought stress-induced acoustic emissions. And for that purpose, we developed a particular sensor. It was actually a piezo contact microphone. It had a needle soldered on it that we could stick into the bark of the trees to hear the physiological sounds of the plants. And I had this equipment with me. And just out of curiosity, I stick that sensor with the needle into the soil. So sound of a meadow, you all probably know. You hear the grasshoppers, wind in the grass, traffic noise down in the valley. That's the common sounds that everyone knows. But how does it sound below ground? It sounds like this. So you can maybe imagine that I was sitting for days in that meadow and just listened to that completely, at least to me, completely unknown soundscape. And a few days later, I went to the director of the entomological lab at the Swiss Federal Institute for Forest Research, because the sounds that you hear in that recording seem to be mainly stridulatory sounds, but also vibrational sounds produced by insects living in the soil. So my idea was to ask her if she would know what animals that would be. But she had no clue, and the little research showed that it's a field, if it comes to soil bioacoustics, that is barely investigated. So you find barely papers, and that was actually the very beginning of our research project and my dissertation. So what we wanted to do in the first time was to investigate, okay, we know now soil seems to sound somehow, but do different soils sound differently? So we went to over 20 different places all over Switzerland. One half was in agricultural land and the other half was in forest, and made recordings of the soil. And we did not only recordings, we also took a soil sample with us for being able to identify the animals that we hear in that particular part of the soil. So the sample was brought to the lab and the animals were extracted and identified and counted as well. But there is not only sounds of animals that you hear in the soil, there's a lot of other stuff going on. For instance, you would hear the sounds of roots, plant roots. Why do I know that these are the sounds of plant roots? There is this fantastic study of Monica Gagliano some years ago. Her team, they made a recording of corn seedlings in a nutrition solution and pointed with a laser microphone on the roots, and were able to record these root sounds that are quite similar to the stuff that I've been recording. And the interesting thing is they re-emitted these sounds into the nutrition solution, and the roots started to grow into the direction of sound. So there seems to be also some kind of acoustic orientation in the soil for the plant roots. Sometimes that can be pretty loud, especially when it's very dry. So there's also drought stress in roots, which produces quite a lot of noise in the soil. So here we are closer to plant physiology. What you hear is the so-called cavitation signals. That means certain parts of the water transportation vessels fill instantly up with air and produce this loud rumbling and clicking sound. So actually, the acoustic method here is the only method where you can directly measure something like drought stress in plants. Right, so when we look to the whole acoustic side of what's happening in the soil, you see in that spectrogram that we are talking about lower frequencies. So most of the stuff that you hear in the soil is happening in a frequency range below 2000 hertz. And that makes sense because lower frequency sound is better transmitted in soils, because soils, it's such a complicated structure that mainly damps higher frequency sound. So that makes perfectly sense that also the animals use vibratory sounds to transmit their communication signals. So at the scientific side of all of that, there are measurements, of course. So once you have a recording, be it with a microphone somewhere in the air, but also in the soil, you want to investigate certain things or measure certain things. And in most cases where I'm doing a project, an eco-acoustic or acoustic ecology project, I observe biodiversity, I monitor biodiversity, and we did it also for the first time in soils. And once you start to measure biodiversity, you get to use these so-called acoustic indices. That's just a calculation of what's happening acoustically in a sound file. So you look in statistical, with a statistical perspective on a sound file. That means, here's one example of the so-called acoustic complexity index. That's the index we most broadly use. And acoustic complexity means, simply said, you look at the many different signals, how many different signals are in the recording. And these many different signals represent many different animals. So that's became quite common method to estimate and monitor biodiversity, actually. What you see here is a measurement that we made in the soil in a mountain forest, and the gray line that has this represents something that we discovered while we made these recordings. We saw that there seems to be a certain daily pattern once this complexity starts to rise. And that pattern was closely related to the microclimatic conditions. That means once the sun is shining on the soil, it heats up and the animals in the soil get active, and many different animals get active, of course. So that's something you see here in that graph. Again, in the field, we were, as I said, half of research happened in agricultural land, and there something started to irritate us a little bit. As soon as we were in intensively used agricultural land, the soil was quiet. So there weren't a lot of animals that were hearable. That's something you see here in that spectrogram. So I have two examples here The one at the top is an arable land with organic agricultural management, and the one below is normally conventional managed arable land, and there were quite differences. And that's something we stumble upon every time once we're in agricultural land. So if you have a listen, there's a lot of animals crawling around and communicate with each other. It's also something you see in the spectrogram. Actually, there's a lot more going on when you compare it to the conventionally managed land. You just hear the wind blowing into the plants, but no animal activity at all. So that's something we also saw once we started to analyze our files statistically. So again, I go away from the microphone. Most important is that graph here. So you see here, intensively managed arable land has lowest acoustic complexity, while extensively managed grassland has the highest acoustic complexity. So we saw differences of mood and use in soil. Right, so the problem was a little bit with that study that we just made punctual recordings. That means we went to one place, made a 15-minute recording, brought that to the lab, made the analysis, and that said basically nothing about the spatial and temporal dynamics of what's happening in soils. You have to imagine, or one could imagine, that over time the sounds vary in soils, or especially maybe at different places in soils, they sound differently. And we went back to the mountain forest here in Switzerland, and we're setting up a recording system with 8 soil microphones, so that we were able to monitor for a long time a bigger area of a soil. And interesting thing was that we found, again, these patterns of diurnal activity. So these are so-called heat maps. That means what is pink is low acoustic complexity and yellow is high acoustic complexity. And you see it is rather like patterns here that show that at certain day times the acoustic activity and acoustic complexity rises. Here, that's not the animals, that's a sprinkler system, because certain parts of the forest, because some experimental sounds are complicated. So these are the water drops falling on the sensor and make over. Yeah, so how to make art out of that? That was the first answer to that question. That's a sound installation in form of a transformed shipping container. The shipping container actually is like a big plant pot. That means on the roof there is a garden, and the garden of course has a soil, and in the soil there are sensors measuring the microclimatic conditions, and they transform these measurements into a generative music piece inside the container. But not only that, once you went in here, you see the garden on the rooftop. Once you go in, there is a console with all the soil recordings that you made all over Switzerland. So people could touch the screen and listen to particular places or particular soils of Switzerland. And the idea behind that was to show the people not only how different the sounds are all over Switzerland in soils, but of course also show the problems of human land use, because there are certain places, certain points, once you touch them, you barely hear something. And that triggered quite some discussions in the public, which was a good thing. And you see also some smaller white spots. These are the recordings from the citizen science project. We have a citizen science project still running. People can borrow this recorder here from us and record their own soils. And the best recordings are going to the map here. Best recordings, there aren't so much white spots, and the problem is always if people borrow our recorders, they go somewhere in their garden with the whole family and everyone's like stomping around and you don't barely hear something from the soil. So that's also the reason, but it's not the reason, but actually the focus of the citizen science project was a bit a different one. We had a questionnaire before and after they listened to the soil, and the questions there were more about sensibilization by listening to the soil ecosystem. That was the thing that we were interested in, to see if hearing a soil ecosystem changed the perspective of people on soil ecosystems in general. Of course it did. Of course it did. Yeah. Oh, there's still some music here. Yeah. Then another thing is the recorder here that we developed. So the problem is always when you do acoustic research or ecoacoustic research in general, there isn't so much technology that you can use. There are certain recorders, automatic recorders that you can buy. But our problem was always, yeah, but it's good, but it needs to do more actually as the device that you could buy. So you end up in the workshop soldering things, and that's what we always call experimental soldering. Most of the cases it's like burning off. And we reached a certain point where we just had to say, okay, we need to develop a device that is usable for most of our different research projects, not only in the soil, but also above ground. And we ended up to develop this recorder, which is now built by a company in Switzerland. So what you see here, and you can have a look at it later in the, I think later is anyway a post, so I can show you a little bit. So that's the soil microphone. Soil microphone means there's this needle here that you can stick into the soil, and that operates like a waveguide. It means it's an antenna that catches up the vibrations and signals in the soil and makes a signal at the piezo sensor that can be recorded. And most important is this little device here, that's a preamplifier. And this one is a very strong one. It amplifies the signal 1,000 times. That's because you can't lie on the ground with your ears and hear something. You really need to amplify the noises of the soil animals. And here's the one of the microclimatic sensors. It's for air. That means it measures temperature and humidity, but there are also others for measuring the same thing in the soil itself. And it's a device that you can program completely by yourself. That means you can tell in which intervals it should record for how long. It has a GPS module, so it always knows where it is. That's especially important for arrays of recorders. And that's maybe the biggest benefit of these smaller devices that can record over a long period of time. You get an impression of a landscape, really a spatial impression. So if you have several recorders dispersed in a particular landscape, you get an idea of what's happening at the same time at different places. And once you do interval recordings, it's like a time lapse. So you have a spatial and a temporal compression of what's happening in the landscape. And that's something I often use in my sound art installations to make that perceptible. Yeah, what else? One last recording, maybe. That's what you typically hear in the soil, and the very loud signal that you heard at the beginning was ants talking to each other. So they make these stridulation sounds with their mandibles. And the other thing that sounded a little bit like a cow wasn't a cow, it was a vibrational signal of a groundhopper. Groundhopper. Yes, that's it. If you have any questions, I'm pleased to answer them. Yeah, the question was, how do I know that these were the ants and the groundhoppers? That's a complicated thing to answer because you need to, when you do a recording somewhere, you need to take a soil sample with the animals in it. take it to the lab, take the animals out, and then you're able to say that animal most probably produced that sound. But it goes even further. So there's actually, at the moment, we do a study in Berlin where we identify single species automatically with a computer software by machine learning. So that means we have one species, several individuals of one species in a pot, and record them individually. And then we add other species and try to train the computer to hear out one particular animal. That you put in, how far can it hear? Well, the first question was, I just surface above versus below ground, what is hearable, and that's an important question, an ecological question as well, because where is a frontier, a system frontier in ecosystems, and most of the barriers or frontiers of ecosystems, they overlap, of course. That means that's especially the case in soils, because as you say completely correctly, a lot of animals, they roam at the surface, they go sometimes into the soil, then they leave it, go to the plant. So it's not completely clear which organism is only soil-based. And that's also a problem once you start to identify certain animals in a soil sample, because once you hit the tube into the soil, the bigger ones, they're already gone because they're, I leave. So you just have the smaller ones that are struck somehow in the structure. That's one thing. And the other thing is, how far can we hear with the sensors? I would say we made some transmission tests, and of course it depends on the size of the animals, but the smallest one that we can hear are the mites in the soil or springtails, and we hear them in a distance of about 30 centimeters. Yeah. So the question was if there are any technical artifacts that could let us think that we hear the soil animals. There are some. There's a lot of noise, for instance, because the amplification is quite strong. But I normally let the noise in the recording. For the measurements, it doesn't play any role because we just cut everything above 2000 hertz off, and that's most of the noise is gone there. And but there aren't really any other artifacts besides the noise. But the problem is, and maybe that's a problem of every field recordist, it's a nice weather method. That means once it starts to rain or to heavily wind, you're limited in having a usable result, because if raindrops hit the sensor as well as they would hit the microphone, they mask everything else. But it's not a problem, especially if you look at statistics. Statistically, if you're not in the Amazon rainforest, there's not so much rain everywhere, so you can cut it out or just compare it with weather data from the particular region that you're working in. And of course, there are the so-called anthropophonies. So that's actually the project I'm working now in Berlin, is that we investigate the effects of noise pollution in soils. That's actually something I wanted to show, but it didn't work. My OneDrive completely crapped up, and I got no access to the newer presentation. What we do there is we recorded the acoustic emissions of a tractor, of an agricultural machine, in the soil, and we're playing back that noise to soil samples in pots and see what the effect is. And the effect is crazy high. So fungi stop to grow, plant seedlings germinate later, etc., etc. So there's a huge impact of noise on soil ecosystems, and we barely know that. Oh, sorry, you were first. You mean infrasound? So the question is if I do also record in lower frequency bands like infrasound or even seismic sounds. We don't do that because there you find most of the geophonies, and that's not in the focus of my research. So of course you have physical sounds, especially water evaporating at the surface from the soil pores. You have water movements in the groundwater. It's all things that you hear in the soil, but not particularly in the lower range, because, you know, lower range means always that these are huge objects moving in the ground that produce these sounds, and we are more concentrated on tiny, tiny little sounds. Yeah, basically, well, you have a lot of different acoustic signals in plants in general. So at one hand, you have a lot of the environment because a plant is like an antenna. It catches up the sound waves from anthropophonies and every biophonies, etc., etc. But then what we were more focused on were the physiological sounds. That means mainly related to water transport. So what you hear in the roots in one recording, the not so loud one, is what we call sap flow. But of course, it's not the sap flowing in the water leading tissue because that's too slow. You won't hear rushing it. But there are always gas bubbles included in the fluid, in the sap. They move from cell to cell, and once they move, they produce a sound, a crackling sound. That's one thing you hear in a plant. The other thing are the so-called stress-induced sounds, the cavitation pulses. That means you have to imagine a plant once it's starting its photosynthesis during the day, so the sun shines on the plant. There's a lot of evaporation of water in the leaves or in the needles. So the plant is under pressure to be able to produce to transport the water from the roots to the crown. And that under pressure is extremely high. So once there's a lack of water in the soil, certain water columns start to collapse by producing a loud click. So there's a gas bubble forming in the water leaking tissue that produces a loud click. And that was also a topic of one of my sound installations to show how plants suffer in a drought period. And the good thing or the interesting thing about that was you could also show something abstract like climate change in plants or effects of climate change by their stress signals, acoustic stress signals actually. All right. So if there aren't any more questions, I'm just here having lunch. Just ask.